Hi everyone, welcome to Spring Security Part 2. Uh, Before starting this video, let me recap what we have seen in the last video. In the last video, we have check out the first part. We have created a basic Spring Boot application with a REST API, and we have added Spring Security dependency to our class path. And also, we have understood how Spring Security does the authentication on a high level. If I show the code, this is what we have. We have a movie controller which returns a model and view object. We are returning this view movie page, and this movie page has this movie data in the form of table, and to the controller the data is provided by the service movie service. In service we are configuring this movie list of movies. We are creating a dummy movie list and assigning to this, and we are using this get method to return the movie list to the controller layer. In control layer, we are gonna give this data to the view, movies page view, and in movies page is a HTML file or view is HTML, and here I'm looping through it and creating a table and showing it. So let me just run this. um, Meanwhile, let me go and open a tab. Localhost, yeah, this one. Yeah, what is it? Port by default, yeah. We have yeah. This is what, so that's what we have seen. We have a default user created by Spring Security. So the password will be printed over here in the application logs, and the default username is user. And when we log in, then we'll be able to check out the movies page. What is the URL of the movies? Get movies. Sorry. Yeah. Slash get movies. Yeah, so this is what we have seen in the last video. We have created a basic Spring Boot application with some control. So the next part is till this Spring Security creates a default user and does the authentication on that. But in a real world application, that shouldn't be case, right? This won't be of any use. So we're going to see how we can configure our custom users to the Spring Security so that it can do the authentication for those our custom users. We're gonna save our users in the memory, and Spring Security does the authentication. So next, in the next part is to see in memory authentication and authorization, and also so this is the main thing which we are going to see. So before that, I'm gonna explain how Spring Security does the authentication internally. Before we do the configuration of in memory, so if we understand how the Spring Security authentication works internally, then even when we do the configuration in memory authentication configurations, it will be easy to understand. It will be easy when to understand that why we are doing that. So this video is totally gonna about how Spring Security actually works internally and how it does the authentication. So that's what we're going to see in this video. Feel free to skip to the next video if you just want to see the configurations. So if you want to see how Spring Security internal works, stay on this video. Yeah, we shall start. Yeah, we should start the video and see how Spring Security actually works. The first part. So this is flow diagrams I have created. So the first part which we gonna see is bunch of classes in Spring Security jar files. So when we add Spring Security to as a dependency, So it's gonna add a bunch of jar files, bunch of Spring Security related jar files to our application class path. So the two main jar files are, so one is Spring Security Core jar and Spring Security Web jar. So the one of the class of Spring Security Core jar file is a interface called user details. So as the name suggests, this user details uh, is a user object. So Spring Security by default, it's gonna use the this object to store the user details, basic information, such as username, password, and bunch of other details as well. So this is what Spring Security internally uses, and the other interface called user data service. So this user data service, let me go to the code and show you. User data service, yeah. So this user data service, it's an interface. So as the name suggests, this service manages the user details object. So this mainly gives us this functionality. So whenever we give any username to this service, it gonna contact the user details information it has, and it gonna return the user details specific to this username. So this is what this user details does. So so let us go to this user details object. So this, as I said, this is the user details object. By default, Spring Security use this. So let us go to the implementations of this user details. So these user details implementations are mainly categorized into two. So one is immutable implementation, and one other one is mutable. So first, let us check the class user. So as I said, this is a immutable one. So this user class has username, password, authorities, some boolean values, so like on non-expired, non-locked credentials, and whether it is the user is enable or not. So it has all the fields which are needed for this getter methods of this user data interface. So yeah, so this is a concrete implementation of user data interface, and we can see some getter methods got overloaded here. So but we can't see any setter method in this class. So this makes this user object as a immutable. So we have constructor and this, and also additionally we have this erase credentials functionality as well. This we get it from this credentials container interface. So this method what it does is it basically sets the password of a particular user to the to null. So and also we have static class, which is the builder class. Basically this is the builder class of this user, and we have this in a static class as well in this user class, and it has its bunch of methods and its implementations as well. So this is the user object, and so this is an immutable one. So now let us check the mutable one, user details. So if we go to this flow chart, so this user details interface is implemented by this mutable user details interface. This is this is extend this interface extends this user details interface. Let us go and check that interface first. So this is that interface on top of user details functionality to get password, and apart from this getter methods, this mutable user details gonna give some additional functionality, which is to set the password of a particular user. So using this we can change the password. So when we create this, when we use mutable user object, so we can have the functionality to change the password of a particular user. Now let us check the implementation of this. The mutable user implements this mutable user details. So basically this has two fields. One is password, and another is user details. User details is private and final, such that we can't modify this. So whenever we want to create a mutable user object, we need to pass a user details object. So since you can create a custom class and implement user details object and pass it to this to create a mutable user, or else by default, since with user details we have a concrete implementation of user, so you can create a user object, so which has all the password, username, and all things. So and then pass it to this mutable user constructor, such that we'll have a mutable user wrapped onto which will have the user object, and also it will have the password of that particular user. And since it provides us a certain method, we can change the password of this mutable user. So this is how this works. So in a nutshell, Spring Security uses this user details method to store the information, but it's not going to use this user details object to do the actual security logic. So internally, it's gonna encapsulate user details into an object called authentication that we're gonna see later in this video. So this is about user details, and this user details basically manages this user details object. So it gonna give the user details. So with the username we have. So let us check the implementations of user details service. So we can see these are the implementations of user data service. So we have caching user data service, in memory user data manager class, JDBC, DO impel, JDBC, user data manager interface decision, and user details delegated this is static class in web security configure adapter. So these are a couple of implementation of this class. So all these implementations will have a relationship with the user details object, and also all this implementation will override this load by username method. So whenever user request the slash login URL, so with the user name and password from in the set to the HTTP request. So the authentication logic basically calls our user data service. So our user data service, it's a responsibility to give the user data object based on the username given by the user. So due to that, this all these implementations will have a relationship with user data object. Whenever it gives the when authentication logic gives the user data string, it gonna return to the authentication logic to perform the authentication using this user data. So since this video is basically about seeing in memory authentication, let us go to in memory user data manager. Yeah, so in memory user data manager, it basically has two fields. So one is a map. It is the user's map. It is a map of string. So the string is basically it will take the key as username, and it has the value as mutable user details. So whenever so in the next video when we check out the configuration of in memory uh, in memory authentication. So when we configure our custom user details, so custom user details to in memory authentication, so internally it's gonna come here and store those user details which we have set in this map. So it's gonna create a mutable user and gonna create this map and use it over here. The other field is authentication manager. This we're gonna see later in this video. Yeah, so and also before checking out the methods, let us check the flow diagram of these. So as we have check that in the code, we have our user data service. So we have bunch of implementations. So this we have caching data service, JDBC DAO. This is static class in web security configure adapter, and we have an interface which is extending this user details, and this interface is implemented by our in memory details manager. So this class will have methods accommodate for functionalities promised by this interface and also this interface. This interface user details, as we have already seen, basically it has the load users by username functionality. And since we have, just like we have seen in the flowchart, this in memory user details manager implements the user details manager, and user details manager extends the user data service. So this user details manager gonna provide some additional functionalities. So to create the user, to update the user, delete, change password of your user, and also whether to check whether the user exists or not. So this is the some additional functionalities which this will have. So we can see all the methods of user data manager overridden here, and also we can see this load user by username method. So in this method is of user details service implement interface. So this got overridden here. So whenever during authentication, so if we assume we have configured in-memory authentication. So let me go to flowchart. So suppose let me go create and the here. So in memory user manager. Okay. Um, so in memory user manager, and also I gonna create one more block, which is authentication logic. So yeah, 24, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so what it does is, so whenever user, so let me create an arrow. Yeah, and let me create uh, another one. This is HTTP request. So let me increase the font of this. So whenever user goes to slash login page, so suppose like as we have seen, whenever user goes to slash login page and enters the password over here, so we're gonna get a HTTP request. We basically we will get a servlet request, and we're gonna catch it to HTTP request. So internally it gonna trigger the authentication logic. So this is in spring security jar files. In one of the spring security jar file has this authentication logic. So this user HTTP request has the username and password. So our authentication logic basically does the all the basically has the core authentication logic. As the name suggests, it has the base. It handles the authentication. So it's gonna request our in-memory. If we configure in-memory authentication, you're gonna ask our in-memory user manager. So here, yeah, in-memory user details manager. So to give the user details object, so it's gonna request our this load user by username. Gonna give user, and we're gonna ask for user details. So since during configurations we're going to give the user details and username and password, it's going to store in this map. So when we request when user requests the to do the login, we're going to come here and cross check whether we have the user details object with the specific username or not. And if it is not there, we're going to throw an exception. If it is there, we're going to create a user object uh, from this user details object, and we're gonna return this. So basically our, as the name suggests, so this is an, since this in memory details in memory user details manager is an implementation of user details. Basically the main usage of this with respect to authentication is to return the user details object by taking the user name from the request when authentication logic request it to do. So this is what in memory user details manager does. Yeah, so since till now we have seen all about user data service and user details object. So we have seen how we manage user information and how we gonna retrieve it. Now let us see how let us see the authentication logic. So yeah, so we gonna see, till now we have checked out this part, user details part. Now we are gonna check this authentication logic block. So for that, I think in previous video we have talked about how Spring Security does the authentication. We have discussed it gonna add bunch of filters which gonna intercept the request to servlet and does the authentication logic. So and also we have seen it gonna log the Spring filters which it has added in the logs. So these here the filters. Let me open a notepad. So this log is printed by Spring Security. So we can see this log. So it has added a bunch of filters. One of the filter is one of the filter related to authentication is this username password authentication filter. So let us copy this and go to our code and let us go to this authentication filter. Yeah. So let us go to top. So we can see this is the username authentication filter, and this class is extending an abstract class, abstract authentication processing filter, and this is extending generic filter, and this is extending implementing this. So we can see that this abstract class is implementing the filter interface, and it's gonna have the do filter class. So whenever any servlet in our application receives a request, so it gonna come here, so it gonna intercept it here. So we'll this method will get a callback. So we'll get this parameters servlet request and this thing, then we're gonna cache it to http servlet request, and we're gonna call this method do filter method. So whenever user goes to any url, not only your login url, we're gonna come here. We're gonna have http solid request, solid response, and filter chain objects. So over here, what we gonna, I'm not going to go inside this method, but what we do basically in this is we're gonna check whether it is whether the URL in this http request is of type slash login or not. If it is slash login, uh, we will go to this else block. If it is not a slash login, we just gonna call the super method of this. So if it is a slash login, we're gonna come here. So over here, using this http request and response, we'll be calling this method. So we'll be calling the attempt authentication of this filter class. So if we go to this one, so this is a abstract class. So this is implemented in our user name password authentication filter. So basically this filter implements the filter interface and overrides the do filter method, and this username password filter has this overrides the abstract method of this class one, which is attempt authentication. And this is a starting part of our authentication logic. So we gonna take http request response objects, and we're gonna return back the authentication object. So before going to this logic, let us check this authentication object. So this authentication object is basically an interface. So what are the functionality of authentication object? So before doing an authentication, we're gonna store our username or into this field principal, and we're gonna store the password in credentials field. So and it also be helpful to check whether at any point of time we check whether the authentication is done or not using this field. So these are the three main functionalities, and it also gonna give if we set the authorities of a user, it is also going to store the user authorities of that particular user. So basically a authentication object is specific to one particular user. So it's gonna store those user details. Before authentication, it's gonna store the username in this one and password to this one. And after authentication is whole done, we're gonna set our user details object, which we have seen earlier. So our user details object, which will have the user store the user information, we're gonna create an object of this and attach to here. So and return this authentication object. So this is where our authentication core logic begins. So over here, first we'll check whether this is post or not. So since this is a login, we need to do authentication. If it is not a post, we'll go to else. Otherwise, we'll just throw an exception. So over here, we're gonna get the username from the request and also the password from the request. And using these two username and password, we're gonna create this username password authentication token object. So we're gonna let us go to this class. So this class basically implements this authentication object. So our authentication object is implemented by this. Basically it gonna overwrite two, since it direct extended the class which implemented the authentication. It it only gonna implement certain methods of authentication object. So it gonna override get credentials method and also the get principles method. So it has two fields, one is principal and one is credentials, and have two constructors. So over here, when we are here, we are creating an object of this using username and password. It's gonna go to this constructor. So as I said previously, it gonna set the we gonna set username to principal and password to credentials. So and also this set authentication method will be set as false because authentication is not done yet, since this is the beginning. And we're gonna use this user name password authentication token. This is basically of type authentication, is basically is an implementation of authentication interface. So we're gonna take this object and we're gonna call the authenticate method of uh, of an interface called authentication manager. Let us go and check this. Yeah, this authentication interface. So now now it till now it all now let me go to this flowchart. So till now we have been in Spring Security Web Jar. So over here we got our request intercepted in this filter abstract authentication process do filter, and we came to this username authentication filter. Over here we created an authentication object. Basically it's a username password token object, and we are trying to call authenticate method of this authentication manager. So let us so this is one more layer in our authentication logic. So here if we check the implementations, so we have four static classes and also one concrete implementation, which is product manager. So when we come to this not this one, when we come to this filter class, so it's gonna get call this get manager method and gonna get the authentication manager of this class, or first filter class. It's gonna get the authentication manager object and it's gonna call the authenticate manager of this. So I'm not going to detail of which type of object has been set to this filter. So in this when they are initializing bean, it gonna set this authentication manager object using this its concrete class implementation, which is yeah, let me go to this authentication. So it gonna this provider manager. So a provider manager object will be created and be set to this authentication manager. So I'm not going to detail on where and how it and at which location it got set. So basically, what happens is, let me close all this unnecessary classes, this, and also we don't need this as well. Provider manager we need, this as well we don't need. This as well we don't need right now. Token, yeah, this as well we don't need. So in our filter class, when we gonna call the authenticate method, basically it's gonna come to this this implementation of authentication manager, which is provider manager. So as the name suggests, so the main usage of this, let me give the explanation of provider manager. The main usage of provider manager is this functionality authenticate object. It gonna authenticate method, so it gonna take the authentication object and return the same authentication object. So internally, so based on the authentication object, it gonna pick the you're going to pick an authentication provider object. So this authentication provider is an interface. It's going to pick right class based on the authentication object, and it's going to call the authenticate method of that particular implementation. So this is our maybe I can say this is our final layer in core layer of our authentication. So this is where our this is where our authentication core authentication sits in this authentication method. So when we come to this authenticate method of provider manager, so over here we can see that we are taking the authentication object and we are getting the class of this. So from filter we have created a username password authentication token. So since this is an implementation of this, when we call to this method, it takes authentication, so it's gonna be casted to this. But since we have created this is of type username password authentication token, so this class will be to test will be authentication, and we're gonna get the providers. So this providers is a list of our interface. So when we start looping here, we gonna go to check this if we have if block. So we gonna check here. So this is of type username password authentication, and we gonna when we gonna look through this authentication providers, so it gonna go to this supports block of supports method of every provider, and gonna check whether it returns false or not. So let me go to one of these methods. So when we go to abstract user details authentication provider, so over here let me go to support method of this one. Here we can see. So to this we're gonna when we pass the class object, it's gonna check whether our parameter is of type username password authentication or not, or else as we are using is assignable from. What it does is it's gonna check whether this parameter is of type this or not, and also it's gonna check whether this is a super class or super interface of this parameter or not. So since from here we're gonna get a username password. From here we send username password authentication to here we'll get a type of username password authentication. And when we are calling here in this abstract user details authentication provider, one of the implementation of authentication provider, so here this will be true since this will be of type username password authentication token. So this will be true, and we're gonna go to this loop and we're gonna call one of the method. Yeah, we're gonna call trigger the authenticate method of the particular provider. So in this we're gonna come here. So in this flow we're gonna come to this abstract user details authentication provider. So we're gonna come here and we're gonna come to this authenticate method. So yeah, I hope yeah, I think this might be confusing. So let me give a quick or overview. Let me go to our flow diagram. Yeah, let me go to a flow diagram. Yeah, Yeah. So it all started in Spring Security WebJar. So where our filter intercepted the server request and it redirected the HTTP server request and response objects to this user password authentication, which returns an authentication object. And from there we basically from filter we made a call to authentication manager object. So one of the implementation of authentication manager object is provider manager. So in this flow we will come to this one. So we'll come to this provider manager. In provider manager we are making a call to authentication provider. So one of the implementation of authentication provider, which handles the of type username password authentication token. A username password authentication token is a implementation of this authentication interface. So as this supports that type, we're gonna come here. So till now we came from Spring Security Web to Spring Security Core. We came from filters and we came to authentication manager, and we came to authentication provider. So now we shall go to authentication provider and see. So this is the place where the core authentication logic happens. So over here we it gonna take authentication object and return the object of same type authentication. And over here, so what it does is first it will basically takes the username from this authentication object, and then first it will check whether the username is cached or not, and gonna check this user cache. If we have the username, it gonna return this. If we don't have the user details object with this username in the cache, we're gonna call this method retrieve user. So to this we're gonna pass two objects. One is our username. This from filter we got this. This is basically originated by user, and this is the authentication object which we have created. So we're gonna call this retrieve users. So this is an abstract method of this class. Now if we see the implementation of this, the implementation of retrieve user is basically is in DAO authentication provider class. So what does this DAO authentication provider does? Let us quickly go to our flowchart. So our authentication provider calls the retrieve user method of DAO authentication provider class. So this DAO authentication provider, in this authentication flow, the responsibility of this is to interact with user details object. It's gonna interact with user details object. So user details, sorry, not user details object. It's gonna interact with user data service. And as we have previously seen, user details object basically handle manages a user details object. So user details service will have a connection with user details object, and it gonna have this load users by username. So it's gonna take username and return user details object. So this DAO provider basically contacts one of the implementation of user details and return user details object to our authentication provider. So this is what DAO authentication provider does. So how does DAO authentication provider class picks a right user details manager? So this is where our configurations help this class. So this DAO authentication provider has this field called user data service. So this user data service, we can see we have our in-memory caching, JDBC, and these things. Whenever we call this retrieve user, it gonna get the user details service object of this class, and it gonna call the load user by username method of that particular service. So when we do the configuration, memory authentication configuration, we have to make sure that we will set this object, will create an object of this interface by using uh, in memory user details manager class object. So we gonna create an object of this in memory one and gonna set it to DAO authentication manager. So this is what we have to configure, such that what it happens, what it takes care of is such that it will call the load user by username of our in memory details manager. And in this in memory user details manager, we have to configure other thing as well. We have to configure these users. So we have to give our custom username um, and password details and store it in this map. So let me write it here. We're gonna need to do two things. So let me increase the font. So one is configure user details service field of DAO authentication provider as in memory user details manager. Yeah, I think this is the name, in memory user details manager. So let me increase. So this is the one thing which we have, which we want to, which we should configure when we when we want to configure for in memory authentication. So, and the other thing is add some hard coded values to the uh, user details object and use that to populate the users map of this class in memory authentication class. So our basically our in memory authentication configuration should do two things. One is setting the user details field of DAO authentication provider as of type in memory user details manager, and to that in memory user details object we have to set populate the user map field with our hard coded user values. So we need to configure this user hash map with our custom values, and we need to configure this user details object with this in memory user. So this is the configuration which we have to do, so such that when we come to this retrieve user class from this authentication provider, we're gonna come to this DAO authentication. So over here it's gonna call our in-memory user details manager. It's gonna retrieve the user details. So if the user details are not configured, I think it's gonna throw an exception. Let us check. Yeah, it's gonna throw an exception if user details is not with this username. So and then this retrieve user is gonna return the user details to our provider class. This provider class basically does the authentication. So I mean, not the whole authentication, the whether user is present in the in memory or not, that is been checked over here, and if it is not, they're gonna throw an exception over here. And over here, after we got this user details object from retrieve user means, I mean, this DAO authentication provider. So this user object is gonna be used to do two things. One is pre-authentication checks, and other is this post-authentication checks. And other one more thing is to create an authentication object. So the written type of this one is authentication. To create this object it's gonna be used as well. So if you're gonna check this pre-authentication checks over here, what it basically does is, in pre-authentication checks, it's gonna check these three fields. Our user details object has these fields as well, right? Non-expired, non-locked credentials, and it is not enabled or not. So it's gonna check this non-locked and whether it is enabled or not, and it is non-expired or not. It's gonna check these three things. And if we go to the post authentication one, and if you go to post authentication check, since we're gonna come to this default post authentication, or here it's gonna check whether the credentials is expired or not. So these are the checks which gonna happen in this authentication provider. So this is the flow till now. It gonna start from filters and come to providers will contact our DAO authentication provider, and this provider will contact our user details service, and user details service will have the connection with relationship with user details object, and that's how the authentication takes place. And at the end, our user object is going to be used to create an authentication object. So if you go to this one, so here our user object, if we see, if we come here, yeah, so if we come here, we are setting this user object to this principal to return object, and this is the first parameter of this method. So this principal object is passed to this username password authentication token constructor. So over here, this principal object is going to be used to populate the principal of this. So basically, our user details object will be stored in this principal field of authentication field. So and then this provider class is gonna return this object, and in this flow we'll come back to this filter class, username password authentication filter. It's gonna come here, and we're gonna return this authentication object. So this is how our core authentication logic takes place internally in Spring Security. So let me give an overview of what we have seen. So we have seen user details object, which is used to store user information, and we have seen user data service. This manages the user details object basically, and we have seen this DAO authentication provider. So this DAO authentication provider contacts the right user details object, so and gets the user details object based on the username, and it's gonna return it to the authentication logic. So authentication logic, core logic, sits in this authentication provider. So this authentication provider will get a call from our filter class. So this is the filter username authentication filter. So this is extended by the so this class extends this abstract class, and this class basically implements the filter class, intercepts a servlet request and gets the request, and come to this flow. So the the one thing which we need to learn understand from this is, so to this logic coming to here, coming to this authentication provider, this is common even if you use jdbc authentication, or even if you write a custom user details service class and implementing the service details interface. This flow is same. It will come here, this will come to this, it will come to this provider, and it will come to DAO authentication provider. So, in order to configure our right type of authentication, we have already seen that we need to do two configurations. One is configuring user details service field of user details authentication as our of our needed user details service object. So over here, since I want in-memory authentication, so I'm going to create an object of in-memory user details manager, and set to this field, user details service field of the authentication, such that when we come to this flow, it's gonna use that object. We're gonna go to the load user by username object of that in memory user details. So similarly, if I want to create my own user data service, I'm gonna create a class. By implementing it, I need to set the user data field type as my custom class. So this is one thing. And the other thing is, when this DAO layer calls our user details object, our user details object we need to have the user details information. So in case of this is one other configuration which we need to set. One is setting the user details field of the authentication provider, and another is providing user details information to our user details object. In memory case, in memory authentication case, we need to populate the users map, which will store the user information in this class. So these are the two things which we need to configure. So yeah, so this is for this video. In this video we have seen how Spring Security internally actually works. How does it actually does the authentication logic. So even if you see, this authentication is similar. Even if we go to Spring Security 5.4 or 5.7 or 6.2 or any 6x, that this authentication flow is the same. Yeah, with Spring, if you use Spring Boot 2x, I think it will directly use Spring Security 5x. So it will use the same flow. Even if you use Spring Boot 3, it gonna use the same. It's gonna use Spring Security 6x. So you're gonna go through the same flow. So this is up with how Spring Security actually works internally. In next video, what we're gonna see is, I'm gonna go to this one. Next video, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do the configuration. We're gonna do the in-memory configuration. So since we have understood in which places we need to configure, so we're gonna do the in-memory authentication configuration, also authorization configuration as well. So we're gonna do it this for Spring Security 5x, and also Spring Security 4x, and also Spring Security 5.7x. I think from Spring Security 5.7 onwards, the configurations have been changed slightly. So we're gonna check these two things. Yeah. So that's it for this video. See you in the next one. Thank you.